Sign these divorce papers, Abigail. I can't live with you anymore. You disgust me.
Sign the papers, Abigail. Adrian's voice cut through the humid Lagos air like a blade. His expensive shoes crunched against the red earth of the cemetery. The priest's prayers still echoed. Her father's casket was still being lowered into the ground. Abigail stood frozen, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant, her father died 3 days ago, and now this. What? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. You heard me. Adrian pulled out a manila envelope from inside his black suit jacket. His face was stone, cold, like she was a stranger, not the woman he'd promised forever to just 2 years ago. The divorce papers. I need you to sign them now. Now? Her legs felt weak. The cemetery spun around her. Adrian, my father just died. I'm pregnant with your child. This can't be. This is exactly when it needs to happen. His jaw tightened. I'm done pretending, Abigail. You're too simple for me, too boring. You don't understand my world, my ambitions. I need someone who matches my vision. Behind him, she saw her, Kioma, his colleague from the firm, standing there in a black dress that cost more than Abigail's entire wardrobe, fake sympathy painted on her perfectly made-up face. Her hand rested on her own flat stomach in a gesture that suddenly made horrible sense. You're leaving me for her? Abigail's voice cracked. At my father's funeral, I'm leaving you because I'm not happy. Adrian's eyes were empty of everything they'd once held. Kioma understands me. She's pregnant too, and she needs me. She makes me feel alive. You? You make me feel trapped. The word hit her like a physical blow. Trapped. Around them, mourners had stopped pretending not to watch. Abigail felt their eyes burning into her skin, felt their judgment, their pity, their silent questions about what she'd done wrong. Adrian's parents stood 20 feet away beneath a black umbrella that served no purpose. It wasn't raining. His mother, Mrs. Okonkwo, had a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Satisfaction. His father's arms were crossed, nodding slightly like Adrian had finally done something right. This had been planned, orchestrated. They'd waited for her weakest moment and turned her father's burial into the stage for her destruction. Sign it. Adrian thrust the papers toward her. His Rolex caught the afternoon sun. Everything about him screamed success, money, power, everything she'd thought they were building together, but not with her anymore. Abigail's hands shook as she took the envelope. She looked down at her father's grave. Chief Okafor had been a quiet man, a bookkeeper for small businesses his whole life. Lived modestly, drove an old car, never showed any signs of wealth. If only you knew, Papa, she thought. If only you could see what's happening. But maybe he had known. Maybe that's why he'd always told her. Patience, Abigail. Let people reveal who they are, then show them what you're made of. She signed, right there at her father's graveside, because fighting now in front of everyone would change nothing. Adrian had already left her in every way that mattered. The pen scratched across paper. Her signature looked shaky, broken. Like her. Good. Adrian snatched the papers back. My lawyer will be in touch about the details. You can keep the flat for now. I'll be moving in with Kioma. He turned and walked away. No hug, no apology, no acknowledgement of the vows he'd shattered or the life he was abandoning. Kioma linked her arm through his as they walked toward the line of expensive cars. She glanced back at Abigail with a look that said, I won. Abigail stood there as the cemetery workers began shoveling red earth onto her father's casket. The sound of dirt hitting wood was the only sound in the world, that and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The mourners dispersed quickly, uncomfortable with the scene they'd witnessed. Some offered meaningless condolences that felt like insults. Others avoided her eyes entirely, like divorce was contagious. She waited until everyone left, until the workers finished their job and departed, until she was completely alone except for the fresh grave and the weight of her shattered life. I don't know what to do, Papa. The tears came then, hot and fast. He left me here, at your burial. How does someone do that? The Lagos wind picked up, rustling through the palm trees, and something inside her shifted. Grief mixed with rage. humiliation mixed with determination. Her father had taught her many things, but the most important was this: never let them see you break. Whatever Adrian and his family thought they'd accomplished today, whatever game Kioma thought she'd won, it wasn't over. Not even close. Abigail didn't know about the fortune yet. Didn't know about the $1 billion her father had hidden away in international accounts, property holdings, and investment portfolios. Didn't know that this nightmare moment was actually the setup for the greatest comeback Lagos society would ever witness. But she would find out soon. And when she did, Adrian Okonkwo would spend the rest of his life regretting every choice he made at that cemetery. He thought he'd buried her alongside her father. He had no idea he'd just awakened something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The flat felt emptier than it had any right to feel. Abigail sat on the couch, the same couch where Adrian used to hold her, where they'd laughed about baby names, where they'd planned their future, and felt the walls closing in. 3 days since the burial. 3 days since her world ended. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table, mocking her every time she walked past. She'd signed them at the cemetery, but the legal process was dragging. Adrian's lawyer kept calling, demanding she sign additional documents. Speed up the process. Stop being difficult. Difficult. She was 7 months pregnant, grieving her father and watching her marriage disintegrate. But she was being difficult. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she didn't want to read. Adrian's sister, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just sign everything and let him move on." His mother, "My son deserves happiness. Stop being selfish." Selfish. The word made her want to scream. Friends who used to invite her out had gone silent. The ones who did reach out came with questions disguised as concern. What happened between you two? Did you know about Kioma? Were there problems we didn't see? Each question felt like an accusation, like they were searching for proof that she'd caused this, that Adrian's betrayal was somehow her fault. Abigail stopped answering her phone, stopped checking social media, stopped pretending she was okay when every breath felt like drowning. She spent her days in her father's study, the one room in the flat that still felt safe. Surrounded by his old accounting books, the faint smell of his cologne still lingering in the air. It was there on the 5th day after the burial that everything changed. She was looking for his address book, thinking maybe there was someone who could help her figure out what to do next. Some distant relatives, some old friends, anyone. The drawer stuck when she pulled it. She forced it open, and something fell out from underneath. An envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with her name written in her father's careful handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter and a small silver key. "My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I pray you never needed this letter. But knowing the world we live in, knowing the people who surround you, I prepared for the worst. In the safe deposit box at First Bank of Lagos, box 447, you'll find documents that will change everything. Accounts, properties, investments. I've spent 40 years building something that nobody knows about. I built it for you, for moments like this. When people show you who they really are, believe them. Then use what I've given you to rise above them. Trust no one until they've earned it. Protect yourself and my grandchild. And remember, patience is the greatest weapon you'll ever have. I love you more than words can express. Show them what an Okafor woman is made of." Papa Abigail read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each word. Accounts, properties, investments. Her father had been a bookkeeper, lived in a modest flat, drove a 15-year-old Toyota. What was he talking about? She grabbed the key and her bag, not bothering to change out of her nightgown and wrapper. She threw on a headscarf and drove to the bank in Ikoyi, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The safe deposit room was cold and private. When the attendant left her alone with box 447, Abigail's hands shook so badly she could barely fit the key in the lock. Inside were folders, legal documents, account statements, property deeds, and numbers that made her head spin. $1 billion. Her father had accumulated $1 billion across international investments, commercial properties in Lagos, Abuja, and London, stakes in tech companies, and carefully managed portfolios that had grown exponentially over 4 decades. Abigail sat on the cold floor of that bank room, documents spread around her like evidence of an impossible truth. How? She pulled out paper after paper, each one revealing another layer of her father's secret empire. A 15% stake in a telecommunications company, property holdings across 3 continents, private equity investments in startups that had exploded in value, blue-chip stocks, government bonds, real estate developments. Chief Okafor hadn't just been a bookkeeper. He'd been a genius, quietly building wealth while everyone around him assumed he was barely getting by. At the bottom of the box was another letter. You're probably in shock. Good. Use that shock as fuel. These assets are structured to protect you completely. Adrian has no claim to any of it. His family has no power here. Take your time, learn everything. Then, when you're ready, show them exactly what they lost when they underestimated you. The prenup they made you sign before the wedding, the one his mother insisted on to protect their modest family trust. That works in your favor now. Everything I've given you is separate, untouchable. Be patient, be strategic, and remember, they thought they knew your worth. They were wrong. Abigail sat in that bank room for 3 hours, absorbing the reality of what her father had done. This wasn't just money, this was power. Freedom. The ability to fight back against everyone who'd tried to crush her. She thought about Adrian, probably with Kioma right now, celebrating his escape from his boring wife. She thought about his mother's satisfied smile at the cemetery. She thought about all the people who'd whispered, pitied, judged. They had no idea what was coming. Abigail gathered every document, placed them carefully in her bag, and drove home with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The grief was still there, the betrayal still burned, but underneath it all, something new was growing. Strategy, purpose, the beginning of a plan. That night, she finally looked at her phone. A text from Adrian. Please just sign the remaining documents. We both need to move on. She stared at it for a long moment, then typed back 4 words. You have no idea. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain, just let those words sit there, a promise and a warning. Abigail placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. Your grandfather left us something incredible, she whispered, and we're going to use it to teach some people a lesson they'll never forget. The game had changed. Adrian thought he'd won by walking away. Kioma thought she'd stolen the prize. The Okonkwo family thought they'd eliminated a problem, but they'd actually just created their worst nightmare. A woman with nothing to lose, everything to gain, and the resources to make sure justice was delivered with perfect, devastating precision. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the kind of strategic precision that would have made her father proud. Abigail spent the next week locked in her father's study, surrounded by documents that rewrote everything she thought she knew about Chief Okafor. The man who'd clipped coupons and haggled at the market had been playing chess while everyone else played checkers. Every property deed told a story. Every investment statement revealed a calculated move. The portfolio was staggering. Commercial real estate in Victoria Island, Lekki, and Banana Island. A 12% stake in a fintech company that had gone public 3 years ago. International properties in London, Dubai, and New York. Municipal bonds, private investments in tech startups that most people had never heard of, but were now worth millions. Her father had diversified across industries, across continents, across risk levels with the precision of someone who'd studied every angle and anticipated every outcome. The phone number at the bottom of her father's instruction letter connected her to Bar Adewale Martins, a lawyer who'd been managing Chief Okafor's legal affairs for 20 years. They met at his office in Ikoyi, a sleek space on the 25th floor with views that stretched across Lagos Island. Bar Martins was in his 60s, sharp-eyed and direct, with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of protecting powerful people. Your father was one of the most brilliant clients I've ever had, he said, settling into his chair across from Abigail. He started with almost nothing and built something most people couldn't build with 10 times the starting capital. Why didn't he tell me? Abigail's voice was tight. Why keep it secret? Bah. Martin smiled slightly. Because he was protecting you. If Adrian or his family had known about this wealth, do you think they would have waited until after his death to make their move? They would have tried to control it, control you, years ago. The words hit hard because they were true. Your father structured everything specifically to keep you protected, Bah. Martins continued, pulling out another set of documents. Every asset is in trust with you as the sole beneficiary. Adrian has zero claim to any of it. The prenup you signed, the one his parents insisted on, that works in your favor now. It clearly states that inheritance and family assets remain separate. Abigail remembered that prenup, remembered how Mrs. Okonkwo had pushed it, claiming it was standard procedure for their family. What can I do with all this? Abigail asked. Practically, what are my options? Bah. Martins pulled up a presentation on his computer. You can do whatever you want. These assets generate approximately $4.2 million monthly in passive income. The properties are managed by professional firms. The investments are diversified enough that market swings won't destroy you. Your father built this to be self-sustaining. $4.2 million monthly. Abigail's mind struggled to process it. She'd been worried about how she'd afford diapers as a single mother. But here's what I think you're really asking, Bah. Martin said, his tone shifting. You want to know if you can use this to fight back, to make the people who hurt you face consequences. Abigail met his eyes. Can I? Bah. Martin smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this question. Your father anticipated that too. He left very specific instructions about what to do if you were ever betrayed or abandoned. He called it his justice protocol. He pulled out another folder marked with Abigail's name and the word emergency in red ink. Inside were strategies, contact lists, step-by-step plans for various scenarios. Her father had literally written a playbook for her comeback. He thought of everything, Abigail whispered. Everything. Bah. Martins nodded. He knew people, knew how they operated, knew that kindness was often mistaken for weakness. So he made sure you'd have the tools to correct that mistake when the time came. Over the next 2 hours, Martins walked Abigail through the structure of her inheritance, how each piece could be leveraged, how the wealth could be revealed or hidden depending on her strategy. There's one more thing, he said as their meeting wrapped up. Your father set up a charitable foundation in your name. It's currently dormant, but it's structured and ready to activate whenever you choose. The Chief Okafor Foundation. He believed that real power wasn't just about having money. It was about being seen as someone who uses it well. The foundation documents showed a $50 million endowment ready to be deployed for causes her father had cared about. Education, healthcare, women's empowerment. Abigail left Martin's office with a briefcase full of documents and a mind full of possibilities. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, just breathing, processing, planning. Adrian thought he'd left her with nothing. He had no idea he'd walked away from a woman who could buy his parents' house with pocket change. Kioma thought she'd won by stealing him away. She didn't know she'd claimed a prize that was about to become worthless. The Okonkwo family thought they'd successfully removed a problem. They'd actually just created an enemy with unlimited resources and nothing to lose. Abigail's phone buzzed. Another text from Adrian. Abigail, this is getting ridiculous. Just sign the final papers so we can both move on with our lives. She stared at the message, then at the briefcase beside her, filled with proof of a fortune he couldn't imagine. She typed back slowly, carefully. I'll sign when I'm ready. Until then, enjoy your new life. I know I'm about to enjoy mine. She hit send and started the car. There was so much work to do. But first, she needed to go home and rest. The baby was kicking, reminding her that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about building a future where her child would grow up knowing that being underestimated was a gift. That patience was power. And that justice, when it finally arrived, was always worth the wait. The whispers started slowly, then spread like wildfire through Lagos society. Abigail began appearing at places she'd never been before. Charity galas, business luncheons, art gallery openings, always dressed impeccably. Elegant without being flashy, always calm, always visibly pregnant and radiating a confidence that made people curious. Her first major appearance was at a fundraiser for Lagoon Hospital. She donated $500,000 and made sure the donation was very public. The room had gone silent when her name was announced. People turned to look at this woman, Adrian Okonkwo's estranged wife, writing a check that made most of their annual salaries look like pocket change. Mrs. Okonkwo had been there. Abigail watched her former mother-in-law's face drain of color, watched her lean over to whisper urgently to her companions, watched the panic set in. But Abigail didn't acknowledge her. She simply smiled graciously, accepted the applause, and took her seat at a VIP table near the front. Within days, the questions started circulating. That's Adrian's ex-wife. Where did she get that kind of money? She's Chief Okafor's daughter. I had no idea he had money. She carries herself like old money, doesn't she? Each appearance generated buzz. Each photo generated questions. Each donation generated doubt about the version of events Adrian had been selling. His colleagues at the law firm started treating him differently, with a mix of suspicion and pity that suggested they'd heard rumors he couldn't control. Kioma's social media posts about her pregnancy had slowed down, probably because people were starting to ask questions about why she never showed any visible signs of being 5 months along. Abigail maintained her calm, her grace, her strategic patience. She was building towards something specific, and every piece was falling into place. 2 months later, Abigail gave birth to a son at a private hospital in Ikoyi. 8 pounds, healthy lungs, and eyes that looked exactly like her father's. She named him Simon. God has done so much. Adrian wasn't there, hadn't even known she was in labor. She'd removed him from her life so completely that he would find out about his son the same way everyone else did, through social media posts and whispers. The flowers arrived within hours, arrangements from people who wanted to be associated with her now that her wealth was undeniable. But the most meaningful gift came from Bar Martin's, a letter from her father written before his death to be opened when his grandchild was born. My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, you've brought my grandchild into the world. I wish I could be there to hold him or her, to see your face as you become a mother. But know this, you are stronger than you think, wiser than you realize, and everything I built was for this moment, for you to have the resources to give my grandchild and my free from those who would use you. The next phase is crucial. You've established your position. Now it's time to reveal the truth about those who betrayed you. The evidence is compiled. The strategy is laid out. The moment is yours to choose. Make it count. All my love, Papa. Abigail read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, while baby Simon slept in her arms. The next phase. It was time. 6 months passed. 6 months of building her public presence. 6 months of strategic patience. 6 months of watching Adrian's life slowly unravel while hers ascended. And now, the final piece. The invitation was cream-colored with gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the first birthday celebration of Simon Okafor and the grand launch of the Chief Okafor Foundation, Saturday, 6 p.m. The Oriental Hotel, Victoria Island. 500 invitations, sent to Lagos's most influential people, business leaders, politicians, society figures, journalists, and buried in that list like a bomb waiting to explode, Adrian Okonkwo, his parents, and Kioma Bennett. Bar Martins had argued against inviting them. Why give them warning? But Abigail had been firm. Because I want them there. I want them to see it happen in real time. The Okonkwo family debated for days whether to attend. They ultimately decided they had to, that staying away would look like weakness. They had no idea what was coming. The Oriental Hotel ballroom gleamed like something from a dream. Crystal chandeliers, tables dressed in white and gold, flower arrangements that cost more than most weddings. 500 of Lagos's most powerful people all gathered under the banner of the Chief Okafor Foundation. Abigail arrived exactly on time, carrying baby Simon in her arms. Her dress was royal blue, elegant, fitted perfectly. She moved through the room with a grace that made people instinctively step aside, not because she demanded it, but because something in her bearing suggested this space had already belonged to her before she entered it. She wore confidence like others wore designer labels, and it was infinitely more expensive. Within minutes, she'd spotted them. Adrian was near the bar looking distinctly uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than Abigail's entire outfit, which was precisely the problem. He was trying too hard. His collar was slightly too tight, making him appear to be perpetually swallowing. He'd clearly visited a barber specifically for tonight, and the fresh cut somehow made him look younger, more vulnerable, like a boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Kioma stood beside him, and Abigail's gaze lingered there with clinical assessment. The woman wore a dress that screamed desperation in Hermes print, a flowing emerald gown that attempted to hide the complete absence of her midsection, the section that was supposed to contain the 5-month-old pregnancy she'd been advertising on her Instagram just weeks ago. She adjusted the fabric constantly, never quite comfortable, never quite confident. Her makeup was applied with a heavy hand, dark eyeshadow that looked almost bruised, attempting to compensate for the panic in her eyes. Mrs. Okonkwo, Adrian's mother, stood like a sentinel to his left, her posture rigid with tension. She wore black, though not from mourning. The color was meant to convey power, but it only emphasized the harshness in her features, the tightness around her mouth that suggested she'd spent years practicing her disapproval. Her jewelry was extensive: gold chains, diamond earrings, a watch that probably cost more than a car. But it all seemed to be clanging armor, defensive rather than beautiful. Adrian's father, Mr. Okonkwo, stood silently to the right, his arms crossed over his substantial belly, his expression a mixture of confusion and defensive anger. He wore his suit like a punishment, and the square jawline that Adrian had inherited looked on him merely aggressive. They'd dressed for battle in designer labels and forced smiles. The fake warmth on their faces was visible from across the ballroom. That particular smile wealthy people wear when they're pretending everything is fine, while internal alarms are screaming. They had absolutely no idea the battle had already been decided 3 months ago. They were still fighting yesterday's war. Abigail worked the room with deliberate precision. She thanked donors by name, remembering details from conversations they'd had only once. She introduced herself to journalists with the kind of warmth that made them lean in, hungry for an interview. She held conversations with business leaders that lasted exactly long enough to seem genuine, but not so long as to appear to need their approval. Each interaction was calibrated perfectly, generous without being obsequious, confident without being dismissive. But throughout it all, she maintained absolute awareness of Adrian's position. She tracked him in her peripheral vision the way a predator tracks wounded prey. Not with malice, simply with the focused attention of someone executing a plan that had been perfected over months. She was careful to avoid Adrian's side of the room. Every interaction she had that didn't include him served a purpose. It demonstrated her belonging in this space while emphasizing his increasing isolation. With each person she greeted warmly, with each laugh she shared at someone's joke, the implicit message was broadcast to the room. This woman is not the disgraced ex-wife. She is the center. Adrian is the periphery. 1 hour into the event, Abigail finally allowed eye contact. She was speaking with Mr. Amakachi, a telecommunications magnate who donated substantially to the foundation, when she felt Adrian's stare. She turned slowly, almost casually, and their eyes met across the ballroom. What happened in that moment was worth every second of the preceding months. Adrian's face underwent a transformation. The forced smile he'd been maintaining crumbled. The color drained from his face in a literal wave. She watched it happen, watched the blood retreat from his features, leaving him looking suddenly gaunt and ancient. His jaw went slack, just slightly, as if he was only now truly understanding the scope of what he'd walked into. 3 seconds. That was all Abigail allowed. 3 seconds of that unflinching eye contact. 3 seconds of his complete realization. 3 seconds of his understanding that the woman he'd called boring, that he'd left crying at her father's grave, had somehow become the center of gravity in a room full of the most powerful people in Lagos. Then she looked away, turning back to Mr. Amakachi with a warm smile, touching his arm lightly as she laughed at something he said. The message was sent, received, and filed away. Adrian stood frozen for several more moments before Kioma tugged at his arm, whispering urgently. He barely seemed to register her. At 7:25 p.m., Abigail's nanny appeared discreetly at her side. The signal, time to move toward the stage. She excused herself from the conversation with gracious promises to speak later, gave Simon a soft kiss on his forehead, and handed him to the nanny with the kind of tenderness that made two different women in the room suddenly remember they wanted children. She moved toward the back of the ballroom, toward the stage, with a stillness that belied the precision of her choreography. Every step had been calculated. Every moment had been rehearsed. This wasn't spontaneity. This was a symphony. At 7:30 p.m. precisely, the lights dimmed. The effect was immediate and total. The ballroom fell into a darkness that felt almost complete, broken only by the single spotlight that illuminated Bar Adewale Martins as he ascended the stage. The theatrical setup had been deliberate. Abigail wanted this to feel like an event, significant and carefully orchestrated, because that's what it was. Bar Martins took the podium and the room quieted. People had paid for those seats, people had made room in their schedules. They understood they were about to witness something that would be discussed at dinner tables for years. "Good evening," he began, his voice deep and measured, the voice of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding courtrooms and commanding respect. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate the launch of the Chief Okafor Foundation." He took a breath. "I'd like to invite Chief Okafor's daughter, Abigail, to share some words about her father's legacy and the journey that brought us here tonight." The applause began immediately, and Abigail rose from her seat with the kind of poise that made it seem effortless. She walked toward the stage. Each step was deliberate. Her hand trailed along the back of her chair, a small gesture of stability and control. She didn't rush. She didn't hurry. She moved like someone ascending to a position that had always been rightfully hers, merely delayed in its arrival. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone with practiced ease, looked out at 500 faces, some curious, some skeptical, some hungry to see what this mysterious woman would reveal. When she began to speak, her voice was steady, clear, the kind of voice that made people lean forward without meaning to. "Thank you all for being here," she began, and the warmth in her voice was genuine and carefully calibrated. "1 year ago, I buried my father at Ikoyi Cemetery. It was the worst day of my life." The room was completely silent. People sensed they were about to hear something real, something that cut through the artifice of the evening. I stood there in my 7th month of pregnancy, wearing a black dress that my mother had worn to funerals, watching the woman who raised me disappear into the ground, and I remember thinking that nothing could possibly hurt worse than that moment. She paused, letting that sink in. I was wrong. The single sentence hung in the air like a gong strike. I was wrong because it wasn't just the loss of my father that made that day the worst day of my life. It was what happened at his graveside. It was the moment when my husband, the man I'd promised forever to, the man I was carrying a child with, walked up to me as they were lowering my father into the ground and handed me divorce papers. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not subtle gasps, audible, shocked, horrified gasps. Not in private, not after the funeral, not in a moment of mercy or grace. He handed me divorce papers at my father's graveside, in front of everyone, while the priest was still praying, while the workers were still shoveling earth. I was 7 months pregnant with his child. Abigail's voice never wavered, but somehow the steadiness of it made the words even more devastating. She wasn't performing pain, she was simply reporting it, which made it real. He told me I was too simple for him, too boring, that I didn't make him happy. He said I didn't understand his world, his ambitions, that I made him feel trapped. She let that word sit. Trapped. He left me standing at my father's grave, crying, pregnant, and completely alone. And he left me for someone else. A woman he claimed was also pregnant with his child. A woman his family welcomed with open arms. A woman who, according to him, understood him in ways I never could. The screen behind her lit up with a photograph of Chief Okafor, dignified, calm, his eyes full of something profound that suggested depths most people never suspected. My father knew this was coming, Abigail continued. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. Before he died, he told me something that I didn't understand until very recently. He said, "Patience, Abigail. Let people reveal who they are, then show them what you're made of." She paused, her eyes moving slowly across the room, making certain people feel seen, specifically certain people at a certain table. And then he left me something else. The screen changed, bank statements appeared, property deeds, investment portfolios, international account statements with numbers so large that several people in the audience literally gasped aloud. One woman covered her mouth, a businessman stood up for a better look, then sat back down slowly. My father spent 40 years building a fortune that nobody knew about, Abigail said quietly. $1 billion across investments, real estate, and business ventures worldwide. A man that everyone thought was a modest bookkeeper, a man driving a 15-year-old Toyota, a man living in a modest apartment. He had built an empire that was invisible. Another click. The screen changed again. He left it all to me. Every naira, every property, every carefully planned investment. And he left me something else too. He left me instructions. The room was so quiet that when someone dropped a champagne flute 2 tables back, it sounded like an explosion. Instructions for what to do if I was ever betrayed. Click. Text messages appeared on the screen. The timestamps were devastating. Messages between Adrian and Kioma dating back 8 months. 8 months before Adrian asked for a divorce. 8 months before the cemetery, before he'd even claimed he wanted out. My husband didn't leave me spontaneously, Abigail said, her tone remaining clinical, factual, almost bored with the obviousness of it. He was groomed to leave me. By a woman who saw opportunity. By a woman who saw a man with family connections and decided to make him her target. She let the messages stay on the screen long enough for people to read them, to see the progression, to understand how calculated and cruel the entire betrayal had been. Then came the moment that changed everything. Click. A text message from Kioma to her friend appeared on the screen in font large enough for everyone to read clearly. The pregnancy is fake LOL, but he doesn't know that. It's my insurance policy to lock him down. The man has family money and I'm not letting this chance go. Once I've got the baby story locked in, I'll have him completely trapped. He won't be able to leave without looking like a monster. Abigail is so boring anyway. He deserves better. The ballroom erupted, not quietly, not with polite shock. It erupted. People turned in their seats to stare at Kioma. Conversations exploded in urgent whispers. Someone actually applauded sarcastically. Phones were pulled out immediately. This was news. This was the kind of revelation that would be broadcast to every corner of Lagos society within the hour. Kioma's face went the color of old milk. She looked around desperately for an exit, for a sympathetic face, for anything. She found nothing. She found only judgment, voyeurism, and the cold curiosity of powerful people watching someone else's complete humiliation. Adrian stood up, his face a perfect mask of shock and betrayal. For a moment, just a moment, something in Abigail's expression changed. The tiniest hint of something that might have been satisfaction. Not cruel satisfaction, just the satisfaction of watching a plan execute perfectly. "Sit down, Adrian," she said into the microphone, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I'm not finished." And he sat. Actually sat, like he'd been struck. Because the woman standing at that podium commanding 500 people was not the wife he'd left crying at a cemetery. This was someone else entirely. This was someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. It wasn't just Kioma, Abigail continued once the room had quieted, her tone never becoming vindictive. Just factual. Like she was reporting the weather. My former in-laws orchestrated this entire situation. They planned it. They pressured my husband. They convinced him that I was beneath him, that I would hold him back, that he deserved someone better. Click. Email exchanges between Mrs. Okonkwo and Adrian appeared on screen. Private conversations, stolen conversations, messages that were clearly confidential and now were very much public. "That girl is not right for you. She has no ambition, no connections. You deserve better. We have connections to Kioma's family. Perhaps that would be a better match. Someone who understands your potential." Another message. "Get out of this marriage. We'll help you. We'll pay for the best lawyers. Just get out now before this boring woman traps you permanently." Mrs. Okonkwo's face had gone from pale to red to something that approached purple. She looked like she might actually have a stroke. Her hand gripped the table so hard that her knuckles turned white. Her husband's arm came up to grip her shoulder, but not in comfort, in restraint. The phones came out again. More footage was being recorded. This was better than news. This was narrative. This was justice served cold and calculated in front of 500 witnesses. They thought my father was just a bookkeeper, Abigail continued, her voice carrying a quality that suggested she was speaking not just to the room, but to history. They thought I had no value beyond being a wife, a docile wife, an obedient wife, someone who would accept being cast aside when I was no longer convenient. They thought they could discard me without consequences. She paused, letting her eyes move across the audience, making certain people understand that she was speaking to anyone in this room who'd made similar calculations. My father knew better. He understood that the best protection is being underestimated. He let everyone think he was poor while he built an empire, and he taught me to do the same. The screen changed. Again. Medical records appeared. Kioma's medical records, her fertility clinic appointments, her hormone level tests. Every single indicator proving conclusively, medically, legally, that she had never been pregnant. The pregnancy that destroyed my marriage. The pregnancy that gave my husband permission to betray me, to humiliate me, to leave me at my father's funeral. That pregnancy never existed. It was a lie from the beginning. A strategic lie designed to manipulate a man who was already vulnerable and already turning against me. Kioma didn't just look at her phone. She actually stood up and walked toward the exit, moving quickly, her high heels clicking against the marble floor like an accusation. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her back. She was simply gone, erased from the narrative, no longer worth anyone's attention. Adrian watched her leave, and for the first time, actual anguish crossed his face. Not anguish for what he'd done to Abigail, not anguish for his child. Anguish because he was suddenly, viscerally understanding that he'd been played. "Tonight isn't about destroying anyone," Abigail said, and the room quieted to hear what came next. "I want to be very clear about that. This isn't about revenge or bitterness or the satisfaction of watching people suffer. It's about honoring my father by demonstrating what he taught me. That you don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight dirty to win. You don't need to destroy anyone to protect yourself." She moved back from the podium slightly, letting people see her more clearly. Let them understand that she was speaking from something beyond anger, from something more permanent. You just need to be patient. You just need to be strategic. You just need to have faith that the truth, when revealed at exactly the right moment, is the most powerful weapon that exists. My father taught me that. He built an empire on that principle, and I'm going to dedicate my life to teaching other people that same principle. The screen changed one final time, showing photographs of baby Simon, his small face peaceful and beautiful. Photographs of Abigail with her son holding him protectively. Photographs of a future being built without the people who'd tried to destroy her. The Chief Okafor Foundation will support women leaving toxic situations. We will provide resources for children who need advocates and mothers who need protection. We will support anyone who's been told they're not enough. Because my father taught me that real power isn't about having money. Real power is about using whatever you have to make sure the people who come after you don't have to suffer the way you did. The applause began slowly, then built into something that felt almost religious. People stood. Some people were actually crying, tears of catharsis or identification, or perhaps simply the overwhelming power of watching someone win against impossible odds. Everyone understood that they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. Not just the revelation of betrayal, but the demonstration of strength, the transformation of a woman who'd been broken into a woman who'd become unbreakable. Adrian sat frozen. His face was a mask of devastation so complete that it verged on comical. His mother had her face in her hands. His father was staring at his plate like it contained the answer to questions he'd never wanted to ask. Abigail walked calmly back to her seat, where her nanny had just brought Simon back to her. She picked up her son, held him against her chest, and took a sip of water. She didn't smile. She didn't gesture triumphantly. She simply sat there, a woman holding her child, utterly composed, utterly powerful. It was done. The event continued for another 2 hours, but the outcome was no longer in question. Donors pressed business cards into Abigail's hand, suddenly eager to partner with someone so clearly capable of strategic thinking. Journalists lined up for interviews. Business leaders wanted to discuss investment opportunities. Everyone wanted to be on the right side of the emerging truth. Adrian remained at his table, drinking alone, his parents having retreated to the bathroom for what must have been a private conversation about damage control. His colleagues from the law firm had conspicuously moved away from his section of the ballroom, suddenly finding business more pressing elsewhere. As the event began to wind down, as people started saying their goodbyes and retrieving their coats from the attendants, Adrian found himself standing up. He wasn't sure when he'd made the decision. He simply found himself moving through the crowd, drawn toward the exit where Abigail was saying goodbyes to a politician. She saw him coming and excused herself smoothly, turning to face him with Simon still in her arms. "Abigail, please." His voice was barely a whisper, destroyed by everything he was feeling. "Can we talk?" She turned fully to face him, and the contrast was stark. She was perfectly calm, perfectly composed. He was barely holding himself together. "There's nothing left to say, Adrian. I know what I did." The words came out desperate, fractured. "I know I destroyed everything. But please." His voice cracked visibly. "I was manipulated, lied to. I was stupid and I made terrible choices, but I was being used and—" "You were exactly who you chose to be," Abigail said, her voice not unkind but absolutely firm. "Kioma didn't force you to hand me divorce papers at my father's graveside. Your parents didn't force you to tell me I was too boring to love. You made those choices. You made them consciously. You made them repeatedly, and you made them in front of witnesses. That wasn't manipulation, that was character." Adrian flinched like she'd struck him. "I want to know my son." Tears streamed down his face now, genuine tears, tears that carried the weight of finally understanding what he'd lost. "Please, I have rights, I have legal rights to—" "You have the rights a court decides you have," Abigail said, and there was something almost sad in her voice now. Not sad for him. Sad for the loss of what could have been. And given that you abandoned his mother while she was carrying him, given that you chose a fake pregnancy over your real child, given that everything you've done has been documented and is now public record in front of 500 witnesses. She paused, letting him understand the magnitude of what he'd created for himself. "I suspect those rights will be very limited indeed. My lawyers are already preparing the paperwork." She shifted Simon in her arms, and the baby opened his eyes sleepily, looking at Adrian with the kind of neutral curiosity that small children possess. "My son's name is Simon. God has done so much. He'll grow up hearing stories about his grandfather's wisdom, about his grandfather's patience and strategy, and the way he loved his family enough to protect them even after death. He'll grow up hearing about his mother's strength and the way she chose grace over bitterness. And he'll grow up understanding that patience always, eventually, defeats cruelty." Adrian was shaking now, actually trembling. "Will he hear stories about me?" "Only if he asks," Abigail said simply. "And if he asks, I'll tell him the truth. That his father made choices that hurt people. That his father let himself be led by ambition and insecurity and the whispers of people who were manipulating his weaknesses. I'll tell him that his father chose a woman he didn't even really know over the mother of his child. And I'll tell him that choices have consequences. That they always do. That no amount of money or status or family connections insulates you from the results of your own choices." Adrian reached out as if to touch her arm, and Abigail simply turned slightly away, a subtle but absolute refusal of connection. "Goodbye, Adrian," she said quietly. She walked away, carrying Simon toward the waiting car, toward the future that was completely hers now. She didn't look back, didn't slow her pace, didn't acknowledge his continued existence. Adrian stood alone in the emptying ballroom, surrounded by the detritus of a party celebrating someone else's triumph. Around him, the staff was cleaning up, removing the evidence of the evening, preparing the space for someone else's event. He looked down at his hands, at his expensive watch that suddenly felt like a curse rather than a status symbol, at the wedding ring on his finger that now meant nothing. And he understood, finally and completely, that he'd walked away from everything that mattered. He just hadn't realized it until it was too late. 3 months later, Abigail stood in her father's study, now her office, managing the foundation's operations. They'd opened 4 women's shelters, funded 6 education programs, partnered with hospitals to support single mothers. The work was real, meaningful, exactly what her father would have wanted. Adrian had signed away most of his parental rights in exchange for supervised visits once a month. Visits he rarely used. Facing Abigail, facing his son, facing the consequences of his choices. It was more than he could handle. Kioma had left Lagos entirely. The Okonkwo family had retreated from public life, their reputation permanently damaged. And Abigail? She'd become a symbol, not of revenge, but of resilience, of what happened when you underestimated the wrong woman. This story is a reminder that sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest power, that patience is a weapon, that being underestimated is a gift, and that karma doesn't forget. It just waits for the perfect moment to strike. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because we all know someone who thought they could win by playing dirty, and we all love watching them learn they were wrong. Until next time, remember, never underestimate a woman with nothing to lose and everything to prove.